Okay, so we are actually going to dive into chapter 6 today. I'll give a little bit of a intro, a little bit of a background, a little bit of a glimpse into what the chapter is talking about. It's really finishing the thought that we started in chapter 4, which is all about the spiritual, the Kabbalah of Teshuva. Really, we're at the last few lines in the Hebrew of chapter 5. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of that outside so that we could jump into chapter 6. The end of chapter 5, which is on page 85 in the book, it talks about the idea that in the times of the temple, people would pass away for doing a sin, a violation that carried the punishment of karis, which literally means cut off or excision, I think is the fancy English word. And it's the idea of dying by the age of 50, or Misa b'dei Shemaim, which was death by the hands of the heaven, bless you, which would be a person who would pass away by the age of 60. Um, so one of the main questions that we're going to be answering today is, why is it that nowadays people who commit these violations are not dying by the age of 50 or by the age of 60? But by temple times, they would. So we're going to answer that in a little bit. But just the end of chapter 5, it just discusses one more thing, that even in times of the temple, they would commit a sin when they were 25, but still they would only die by the age of 50. Why? Because similar to a mark that a pen leaves on a paper, the what was the word over here? There was an impression in Hebrew. The term is there was a rishimu on the soul that would allow him to live longer. There was a mark of the soul that's left in the person on the body, and therefore, even if they violated a sin that carries the punishment of karis, they would still be able to live to the age of 50 or 60 because of this impression. So that's just ending chapter 5. But today, God willing, we have a lot to cover in chapter 6. So I have my notes here, and before we read it inside, um, we'll just give a little bit of a background. It's not the longest chapter, but it's a very important one. We talk over here about exile and one of the most foundational ideas of our Chassidus. So it's a very exciting class. I'm excited that we're going to explore it together. And this would be chapter 6 inside. If you're looking, it's going to be on 87. I don't know how much of the text we're going to read inside. I want to give more of a general idea first. Any questions before I jump in? Okay. So I'm specifically using this story. It's an emotionally charged story, one of the most incredible moments of the Rebbe's leadership. But I'm specifically touching upon this story because of the soldiers in the IDF that are fighting to defend our country now. A few of them are my own nephews. One of them, my nephew Eyal, who I'm very close with, and he's just an incredible young man. I got to see him when we were in Israel last year. He's in Gaza, and he was actually just injured by a bomb. And thank God he's okay. He was helicoptered to the hospital, and his family was with him, and they were thank God he's doing a lot better. But his name is Eyal Natan Ben Liora. He was actually our chazan when he was 14 years old, or yeah, maybe 14 years old or 15 maybe, for Rosh Hashanah here. So we love him and very proud of him, and we hope he gets better and his family gets better and all of his friends, some of them that survived and some of them that didn't. But so there was a moment in the Rebbe's leadership. It was 1976. It was the 23rd of Av, Menachem Av. And I don't know what day of August it was, but there's a beautiful video. I wouldn't be surprised if some, if not all of you, watched this video of the Rebbe, where the IDF or an organization connected with the IDF arranged a tour of America for wounded soldiers of the IDF. And for the injured soldiers, they made a tour of America and they traveled around. And one of their visits was to 770, was to meet the Rebbe in 770. And the Rebbe almost always, oh, good, Chavas, I saw the video, good. So the Rebbe almost always spoke in Yiddish. All of the Rebbe's talks were in Yiddish. There were very few exceptions. One of them was actually Lag BaOmer, which we just celebrated on Sunday, 1980. The Rebbe, through his sources, knew that people in Russia were able to secure a way to listen to the Rebbe's talk from New York to Russia. So the Rebbe actually spoke a talk in New York with 10,000 children. He spoke in Russian. Shira, I'm glad you're here. We missed you last night. The Rebbe actually talked in Russian for the Jews of Russia to be able to hear. And I heard from people that were there, like it was a hot day. There was all these kids. No one understood a word of the Rebbe was saying, but the Rebbe was speaking to the Jews in Russia. So the Rebbe spoke in Russian.
How
So
many
another time,
languages? How many languages did he know?
I
French?
don't. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. French, German, Yiddish, obviously Russian. I'm sure a few other ones. English. I don't know. Um, yeah, that's a good point. So another time was 1976, where the Rebbe spoke in Hebrew, and which was pretty uncommon. While the Rebbe obviously spoke Hebrew, um, the Rebbe mainly taught in Yiddish, communicated in Yiddish. But to these wounded soldiers of the IDF, he came and spoke in 770 in Hebrew, and he actually apologized. Starting his talk, he says, "I apologize for using an Ashkenazic accent of Hebrew." Instead of the Sephardic or the modern Hebrew, but the Rebbe spoke with an Ashkenazic accent, and he apologized for that. Um, so at the time, this was a novel idea that the Rebbe spoke about. Now it's obviously very mainstream, but in the 70s, the Rebbe said as follows. The Rebbe said that Jews have always been resilient, and we were always able to transcend the physical by tuning into the spiritual and to allow quality to triumph and to win over quantity. The Rebbe continued to say, we never had a big land. We never had a big people. We were always like underdogs, so to speak. And yet we survived because we were attached to something greater. And the Rebbe says that this phenomenon exists in the human being as well. That just like a land could be small, but we make up for it in quality, or a people could be small, but we make up for it in quality, that a person, a human being, can lack in a certain aspect in quantity of a body, but they have a stronger element in quality, in a dimension of quality, even more than the rest of the people. Because they lack in a certain area that other people have, they compensate by a stronger quality in another area. So, for example, if a person is missing an arm or a leg, it's a guarantee, the Rebbe says, that your quality and power of spirit, creativity, and talents will manifest equal, or if not even more, than by others. And then the Rebbe said it would be an honor if I could greet and meet each of you individually. And usually, like, when I was a child, we all stood in line and went to the Rebbe. But over here, for the wounded soldiers, many of them were in wheelchairs, and they actually cleared out the whole 770 to make space for all of them. The Rebbe actually went from his, the platform from the dais and went down, and you see the beautiful video and some pictures of the Rebbe greeting each single soldier with a handshake and gave them $1, if I'm not mistaken. And there were soldiers that described the moment for them, and said it was a life-altering moment when the Rebbe looked at them and thanked them, not with, didn't give them pity, but gave them understanding. And it says that it's something that they never received yet. It's the first time that they experienced that. Anyway, in that talk, the Rebbe said that instead of being called Nefei Tzahal, which means the wounded or the crippled soldiers, and actually the Rebbe started this topic by saying that even though it's none of my business, but since I'm a Jew, I'm going to mix into something that people may seem as none of my business. And the Rebbe says that instead of being called Nechei Tzahal, the wounded of the soldiers of the IDF, they should change the IDF should change the name of the wounded soldiers to be called Mitsuyanei Tzahal, which means the excellence of these soldiers. And it's not just a matter of semantics, it's actually true, the Rebbe said, because you excel, people that have a physical deficiency, a wound or an illness, they excel in other areas. So today, since that day in 1976, their names were changed to be called Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the excellent of the soldiers, because they excel. And it's remarkable um, because in Torah, we always look for a balance. If you're lacking in one area, it's compensated through another area. Um, so 2 weeks ago on Shabbat, I asked a question in Shul that it led to a beautiful discussion of the idea as follows. The idea is that in 2 weeks ago, we learned the Torah portion of Emor, which talks all about the laws of the Kohen. And one of the laws is that the Kohen is not allowed to serve, not allowed to perform the service in the temple if he has a defect. In Hebrew, it's called a mum. If he has a mum, he's not allowed to serve. A mum, a defect, could be something very small. If I'm not mistaken, even wearing glasses, like I'm wearing right now, is considered a mum. If you don't have 20/20 vision, it's considered a defect. If you have, God forbid, a broken arm, that's a defect. If you have one limb bigger than the other, it's considered a defect. If your eyebrows, touch each other, that's considered a defect. If you're missing a finger, God forbid, that's all that is a defect. In Hebrew, it's called a mum. And if a person has a mum, the Kohen wouldn't be able to serve in the temple. And the obvious question is why? That's the question asked in Shabbos a few weeks ago. Judaism is about inclusivity. Um, no matter who we are, we have goodness inside of us. We're inherently good. Why do we care for an outside factor when we should be more concerned about what's going on inside? Does anyone else have that question, or does anyone resonate with that question? I'm going to take that as a yes. Michelle, do you agree with that?
Sorry, I was my mind was still on your thing with your nephew. That was your nephew you were talking about, right?
Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah. But thank God he's home already. So
Well,
anyway, back to the yeah.
it's a reflection of God. Well, I mean, it doesn't, I like inclusivity, but I think there's also exclusivity in Judaism because we see separation, day from night, light from darkness, heaven from earth, the waters from the waters. You don't combine different threads. There's Shabbat and the rest of the days of the week. There's lots of exclusivity too. So
Oh, good point. So then, so let me. I love that idea. So then, let me ask you, why would we care? Let me rephrase the question then, because that's actually a very good point, Lynn. Why would we care for the external um, uh, um, uh, defects of a person, and not care for the heart? What if the person studies Torah all day, but he has his eyebrows that are touching? He can't serve. Why?
and that would bother me. That's one of those hukots, the hoke we don't have an answer for. It's a lama kacha, because but I think there's something to reflect the beauty and the perfection, the tiferet of the temple and Hashem, and whether I mean, you can't have a eunuch, can't go all the way into the temple. So I think there's an honor and a respect for perfection, or tamim, just like the choshen, because it's for urim and tumim. Do I understand it? No. Can I respect it? I think I can. And I don't have to always know why. I think there's mystery. Maybe we'll find out now, or maybe
Yes.
find out in the Olam Haba. That's how I.
Okay, beautiful. I love it. So I do want to tell you that first of all, it's a beautiful answer about chukim, and this, which is what we're gonna about to delve into, explains this idea in a beautiful way. And I think it's a very foundational idea. So I do hope by the end of today, we'll walk away with the answer to this question. And really, this is not a Torah, it's not a parsha discussion. I'm using this, from the shoulders to the mum of the Cohen to really get to an idea that will tie into chapter 6 beautifully, but it will answer this question at the same time, hopefully.
But I have one
So,
more thought.
yeah,
I
sure.
think Hashem is more concerned with our inner heart and he looks at the inside. And I remember asking my mother when I was a child, I said, why can't people's noses and outward facial features represent what they look like on the inside? Because
Wow.
I thought there's some people that are beautiful on the outside and not so beautiful on the inside. And that used to
Right.
bother me. I wanted it
Mhm.
consistent. And if people aren't beautiful on the outside but had a lovely heart, I wanted them to be the most beautiful people. But I think we
Right.
have to explore and look for that, and that's part of the mystery too.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I think it's also interesting too. I mean, Hashem creates beautiful people and not so beautiful people with defects and people who are perfect. So that's something to think about too. At the same time, too, there is separation between the Kohanim and the Levites and Yisrael and all that stuff. And so we are one. Well, Jews are one people at God, but they're individuals that come together as one.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that there are these divisions, and there is beauty and ugliness, if you will. Just very curious. So
Yeah. So let's get into it.
Yes.
So there's an insight yeah.
Oh, sorry, I
Sure.
was just gonna make a comment. It has to do with what Lynn was talking about. And
Mhm.
the thing is, like, so about including people. So, I was in an accident a little over 20 years ago, and I've had dogs help me I was housebound initially. Well, so when I started going to synagogue, it's all fine, except that at one point somebody tried to get me thrown out because I had Minnie, and Minnie's a perfect dog, right? But a woman walked up to me and she said, dogs aren't kosher, they shouldn't be in synagogue, and tried to throw me out, which meant like I couldn't be there, which I think it's kind of the opposite of what we're meant to be doing, but who knows? Like, maybe it's about the exclusivity, but just making a point that, like, here in the US, like, people are meant to accommodate disabled people, as opposed to say, I guess it has to do with a coat. Are you okay?
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. Okay, so we're going to get into the idea in chapter 6 through the lens of a mimer, which is a Hasidic discourse that many of the Rebbes touch upon this idea, and it's all over Hasidus. So it's a very foundational idea. And hold on one second. Hi, April. Are you able to open up for Sana? Thank you. Sorry about that. The door to the preschool that my daughter goes to always seems to be closed. All right, there we go. Okay, so it explains like this. It says that in Kabbalah and Hasidus, it explains that Torah, I would say maybe even reality, exists within two realms. So not to say that there's two Torahs, but the Torah exists on two different layers or two different platforms, two different dimensions. There's an ideal Judaism. That's when the temple stood. And then there's a less than ideal Judaism, a less than ideal time of Torah. And I'll explain what that means. That's the time of exile. The time of exile, let's start with the time of the temples. The time of the temples, godliness, kedusha, holiness was all apparent. It was all revealed. It was all manifest everywhere you went. You were able to see holiness. Miracles, therefore, were open, were revealed. People saw miracles all the time. And we were able to fulfill all the mitzvahs, all the Torah, all the mitzvahs were able to be fulfilled during the times of the temple. All the sacrifices, mitzvahs related to the temple, which included my favorite mitzvah of bringing the first fruit to the temple, all that took place during the times of the temple, because that was the ideal Judaism. During the time of, in Hebrew called galut, or in English it's called exile, it's the opposite. The opposite means godliness is not revealed, it's very concealed. Miracles don't happen openly the way they used to happen. We can't fulfill most of the positive mitzvahs of the Torah, which means, let me just explain what that means. There's 248 positive mitzvahs of the Torah. Only 86 of them are able to be fulfilled during the times of exile. The rest of them don't even exist. We can't fulfill them, whether the mitzvah is related to a king, whether the mitzvah is related to the Kohen in the temple, whether the mitzvah is related to the Levi in the temple, whether the mitzvah is related to the Israelite bringing the sacrifices in the temple. So many of the mitzvahs, the majority of mitzvahs, the positive mitzvahs, we don't fulfill now. We don't have a united land. We're not a united people. We're fragmented and we're quite literally scattered all over the world. So it's not an ideal framework of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism. So there's an ideal time, which is when we all live together in the land. And then there's a less than ideal time when we're scattered in the exile and we're not capable of even fulfilling all the mitzvahs, and godliness is not open and revealed. In the temple time model, in the time of the temple, which is the ideal model of Judaism, truth was the emet was the center of it all. And therefore, the temple itself, the building of the temple, was the outcome of this truth. And therefore, in the temple, which was the outcome of the truth of the time, and truth was the center of it all, and the center of the truth was godliness, in the temple, we were then able to see open miracles. And it says that there were 10 miracles taking place daily in the temple. Everything danced around this center. Everything revolved around the truth, around the temple, around the center. And therefore, Judaism at the time was fantastic. It was beautiful. You saw the truth of everything you were doing. You saw the meaning behind everything you were doing. You were inspired by just going to the temple. There was an inspiration because you got your dose of spiritual energy. So paradoxically, at the same time that Judaism was fantastic and beautiful because the truth was at the center of it all, and therefore you were able to see godliness so open and revealed, at the same time, it was actually also very difficult. It was fantastic, but paradoxically, it was difficult. I want to explain what that means. Everything was right. Good things happened to good people. Bad things happened to bad people. And therefore, if you went in the ways of Torah, you saw blessings. In this week's Torah portion, the opening verse says, if you go in my ways, if you go in my statutes, if you go in my chukim, you will see incredible blessings. You will have the rain at the proper time, incredible blessings. We start the first two aliyahs. And if you don't go in my ways, there's all these not blessings. 49 of them that we read in this week's Torah portion. So everything was very apparent because there was this truth. Hey, Steve, because there was this truth, you saw the truth behind everything. So 3 times a year, we had what was called Aliyah L'Regel. There was a pilgrimage. And there was a promise that when you make your way to the temple, it was a guarantee by God that no Gentile in your neighborhood will touch or steal any of your property. Like nowadays, even if I go out of town, I don't post on social media that I'm out of town. I don't know if it's a phobia, but when I'm back, I'll post of how great the trip was. But not when I'm away, because we don't know who will be watching or reading that post and then know, oh, you're not home. God forbid, let's take advantage. But in the times of the temple, everyone knew that all the Jews were away, were in Jerusalem, and yet your property would remain untouched. Because the very universe, the model of the time was in tune with this reality. So it was it was perfect, it was fantastic. But it was also very taxing. Paradoxically, at the same time of it being so beautiful, that if you go in the way, you see incredible blessings, it was also exhausting because if God forbid you would go against what the Torah says, everything you built up would crumble. Everything would be lost because you're going against the ways of the Torah. So there was this incredible pressure to make sure you're staying in line. So just to summarize where we're holding, and Steve, to make sure you're up to speed, what we started by saying is that there's 2 eras within Judaism, or 2 models within Judaism. There's an ideal Judaism and a less than ideal Judaism. The ideal Judaism, we're saying, existed during the times of the temple. During times of the temple, godliness, miracles were open and revealed, and everything was as it should be. And therefore, if you good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Um, at the same time that it was fantastic, there was also a paradox where it was exhausting because if you would not go in the ways of the Torah, there was a death penalty that existed for what would seem now like the smallest violation of like, who cares? I ate chametz on Pesach. I ate on Yom Kippur. These things that, it's almost like, come on. Um, in those days, it would carry a death penalty. Why so harsh? Of course, there's fine print to these laws, and it had to be with witnesses, and they would have to have been warned, and they would have to say, "I don't care." They would have to verbally say, "I want to go against Torah." So it was pretty hard to actually put someone to death. But the fact is, the death penalty existed, and the reason is because in the world that existed during the times of the temple, everything was truth. Everything was balanced, which means the connection between us and God was revealed. It was overt. And therefore, if you went against this connection, if you committed a sin, you were going against the current. You were going against what the consciousness of the world was standing on. You were missing how the world was functioning. God's providence, God's supervision of the world was very apparent. The truth of the soul was very real. If you were going against it, you were going against the truth. You were going against your soul. You were going against what was the current, what was the norm, what was parent, and therefore you lost your whole reason for living. That was during the times of the era of the temple. That was what we're calling over here the ideal model of Judaism. When we were able to fulfill all the mitzvahs, when miracles were existing, when the temple existed, and therefore at the same time that it was beautiful, there was also an intensity there because that was the norm, was the truth of your soul. And if you were going against it, you were turning your back on your soul, turning your back on God, and therefore it would sever your relationship with the world and with God, and therefore it would carry a death penalty because you lost your whole model of existence, which was the truth of Judaism. During the time of Galut, exile, which we are currently in, it's the complete opposite. Things are not balanced as it was then. David HaMelech, King David says that nowadays, he says in Psalms, in the times of exile, nothing makes sense. What I mean by that is good things happen to bad things happen to good people, evil seems to be rewarded for their evil. It's chaos. Or olam hafuch, it's an opposite world. Things are upside down. And not only in the general universe and in the general world, but even in our own life. Things don't seem to make sense. We are meditating, and yet we can't get into that mode of a deep connection with God. We study and we forget what we study. We pray and we're not inspired. We're keeping Shabbat and we don't see blessings openly. We're confused and we're living in an imbalanced world. When in times of the temple, it was very balanced, which means if you did the right thing, you saw the blessings. And if you didn't see the blessings. But now we're living in an imbalanced world where it doesn't seem to add up. So almost like the wounded soldiers who were missing limbs, and yet the Rebbe says they compensated with other areas that qualitatively where they were stronger in. We, so to speak, in the times of exile, we're missing mitzvot that we can't fulfill now. We're missing limbs, parts of our godly consciousness that we can't tap into. So Chassidus explains that temple times Judaism was defined by balance. And now, in times of exile, it's made up by compensation, which means we make up for what we are lacking. by extreme polarity in what we do have, what we're not lacking. So, for example, what a guy lacks in his learning, if a person says, I can't study all, it's not sinking in. I don't have the patience or the what we call in Yiddish Sitzfleisch. I don't know how to say that. That's the ability to just sit and focus. The person says, I don't have it, but they could compensate in other things. They could compensate with their resources, whether it's financially supporting people that are able to study Torah and giving generously or volunteering their time um, to support Torah institutions. Or another guy doesn't have the finances or the time, but they have the ability to learn. They have a good mind. So they're involved in Torah study. For some people, they excel on Shabbat. For some people, they excel in their prayers. You compensate for what you are lacking by what we can in an extreme way. So by temple times, everything was balanced. But nowadays, in times of exile, we're living in an imbalanced time where we have either what we would call paralysis, or we have a wound, a missing limb, so to speak, in one area, but we compensate by it in other areas that could be even stronger than what other people have. So it's almost like uncontained, but it's compensation. So what I mean by that is the compensation could be even stronger than even previous generations. So for example, our tefillin that we wear now, we have the resources to make the most beautiful pair of tefillin that I would, we don't know, we never uncovered Moses' tefillin, but I would say that Moshe's tefillin were not nearly as beautiful as the tefillin that we are able to wear. That a 13-year-old boy wears more beautiful tefillin than Moses himself. Moses is the one that taught us the laws and the details of tefillin, but they didn't have the resources to make the most beautiful pair of tefillin and the machinery the way we have now to make the most beautiful pair of tefillin. And the same is with our matzah. I've been to matzah bakeries in Montreal and elsewhere in New York and we've eaten matzah that could taste amazing, and it has the most careful hidurim, which is the most careful stringencies and beauties to the mitzvah. That during the times of the Rambam, they weren't able to make matzah as perfect as we have it now, and be as careful as the way we have it now. So, okay, we can't offer sacrifices and we can't do many of the mitzvahs of the Torah, but we compensate for it in other ways that we can do. It doesn't make the challenge go away. The challenge is still there. The imbalance is still there. The lost leg, God forbid, of the shoulder is still there. But they're able to find creativity, art, music, or whatever else in other ways, in other areas. It doesn't make the challenge go away. It doesn't make their step-by-step walking go away. It's still hard. They still are wounded, but they are able to compensate in other ways. In a similar way, the mitzvahs that we don't have, the imbalance that we live in is still there, but we compensate for it qualitatively in other ways. The wounded soldier, because they're able to compensate in other ways, even though they are wounded, the Rebbe said they should be called Mitsuyanei Tzahal, the excellent, or the ones that excel, because the fact that they still go forward and compensate in other ways, it makes them not only a survivor, but it makes them a hero, it makes them a winner. You show up on the level that you can, and in the times of Galut, that's what we are doing. We're living the best version of our life that we can. In 1968, there was a group of, let me just pause for a second, see if there's any questions on this. Any questions before we go forward?
Well,
Okay.
not a question, but a
Yeah.
comment. I
Yes.
love the Zuyane Zahal.
Yeah.
What I think, and I have a question too, but I think what it does, it says, what do we have in our hand? And then what was great about the Rebbe, he didn't give into excuses. Like, he's like super direct. Okay, so you've got a missing limb, or you're limping, or you're missing your arm. Okay, what do you have? Okay, use that. And I think we need to have, we're raising snowflakes and marshmallows. And we say, oh, we've got a little room over here. If you're feeling bad or you're feeling triggered, go over there. Instead of use the word resilience at the beginning of this, it's like what we can see that the world's going to. We need to raise a whole generation of children who are resilient.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we're doing that. So I love this and thinking about how can we live our best life, our best version of what we have, instead of saying, oh, I have a limp, or I don't read well, or I have a whatever, you know. And so I think we need to kind of flip that around and just say, what do you have? Now let's train for that.
Amazing. And I think, using the word resilience, I've been using the word imbalance and compensation, but together with that comes resilience. That in the times of the temple, resilience didn't really exist because they were either in line and they saw the blessings, or they were out of line and they didn't see the blessings. Resilience comes when there's all this challenge and mistakes, and yet you push forward with a wound, with a limb that's missing, and yet you become a winner. That's where the resilience comes out. And that's what we have in exile times, which I've been calling a less than ideal time of Judaism. And it's less than ideal because godliness is not apparent. That's when you need resilience. Um, Miracles are not open, and that's when you need resilience to be able to uncover something deeper than what's on the surface. In temple times, everything was truth. Truth was apparent. That was the temple. That was the norm. That was the current of the times.
But I want I want
Yeah,
to challenge that a little bit because
yeah,
as you've been talking, I've been thinking in Jeremiah, before the temple was destroyed, the first
yeah,
temple, they're depending on it and using it almost as a lucky charm. And he says,
yeah,
they're saying, the temple, the temple, the temple. We can live any way we want because we've got the temple. And they weren't living according to truth. They weren't living according to Torah. And that's why they ended up in the Galut for 70 years, because they
mhm,
weren't keeping the Shabbats. And he says, okay, you're going to be here now. So this is how I want you to live your life, to plant gardens, to raise your children, to really start to think about it. And that's where the synagogue came from. That's where order of service came from, because they realized they had goofed up. So something
yeah,
happened in the group that was hidden in the temple time wasn't good, but it became
right,
uncovered and revealed
yeah.
during the
So,
Galut.
so absolutely. And I agree with you that when I'm using the term temple times, there were a lot of times in the temple that things were less than ideal, but the overall, the view of God in the world, there was an ideal time. That's when the temple time by God was considered the ideal time. We messed up, and there was incredible corruption during the times of the second temple, when, after the Greeks were defeated by the Hashmonaim,
Yeah.
we all look
By
at the Maccabees as amazing, and they were. But then the next two generations that came after them, things got really out of hand with the descendants of the Maccabees, Hashmonaim as they were called, and there was corruption there. But God, viewed the world, the history, as
right.
a temple time that was ideal. That there
Mhm.
were, if you went in the ways of Hashem, you saw the miracles. There, like in this week's Torah portion, it says that if you go in the ways of God, he will give you rains be'ito at the right time. And Rashi right away says, when is the right time for rain? On Friday night, after everyone's home from shul, it would rain so that it doesn't bother you, but it still waters your field. That's the ideal time. So during temple times, you went in the ways of Hashem, your field got watered at the right time. It was like the ideal, even just the 70 years that you're mentioning the 70 years of exile after the first temple was destroyed. Rashi yesterday in the curses of the Torah portion, it says, why was it 70 years? As a result of the 70 sabbaticals and jubilees that we didn't observe properly during the temple time. So, I think it was like 400, there was 400,
490.
419. Is that what you said?
Yes.
That there were times that we did, but then there were years, there were cycles that we didn't observe the sabbatical. And 7 times 400 and whatever divided by the 7, how many sabbaticals and how many jubilees were missing? It came out to 70, and that's why we got punished with 70, because that was the ideal time. There was an expectation there, and therefore when we went out of line, there was a balance, and therefore if we went out of line, we went out of line, and we had to be punished. But nowadays, our job is to be resilient, and even though we don't see the openness, we compensate it in other ways, and our job is to live the best version of ourselves. In 1968, I just want to make one thing clear: someone, I was on the phone with someone yesterday, and they told me that's why I left Chabad, because they just want you to do what you can, which is true, but this specific person has a family member that's observant, and the family is trying to convince her to stop her observance and not keep Shabbat in an observant way, because you're Chabad, and Chabad, you just do whatever you can, and that's good enough. And I said, absolutely not. No, 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 no. You still have to keep halacha, you still have to keep Jewish law and do what Hashem wants, but realize that wherever you're holding, your job is to take the next step, but you never to take away a step, never to go down. Anyway, we're not going to get too much into that, but our job is to, whatever we're lacking in, whatever resources we're lacking in, we compensate in other ways. And therefore, there's people that we know that are maybe not the best Torah learners, but they'll do anything for Torah. They will, use their resources and expertise in real estate or whatever else to make sure that the shul is beautiful, to make sure that my mother, when she comes, she wants to polish the silver crown. That's her. She loves doing that. She can read Torah the best, but she wants to honor Torah in the best way. She learned from um, her great great aunt somewhere like in Tunisia, that her great great aunt was like the attendant for the local synagogue in their little town of Tunisia, where every Thursday she would bring the oil to make sure there was enough light for the synagogue for Shabbat, and to make sure everything was clean, and to make sure the tablecloths were out, whatever it is, that they did in the late 1800s or early 1900s. She was like honoring the synagogue in the way that she can. So there was a group of students that in 1968, in the late 60s, went to visit the Rebbe. And it was called Yechidut, which is they were able to have, a private audience, but it was a group of students. So it was almost like a rapid exchange of, they were able to ask any questions they want. And one of the great questions that they asked, it's a pretty famous question, is why is it so important to be connected to a tzaddik, to a righteous person? In chapter 2 of Tanya, it says that, all of us have a connection to a tzaddik. And their question was, if we're living a Torah lifestyle, why do we also need a tzaddik to be connected to? We're doing Shabbat, we're doing kosher, whatever it is that we're doing. Why is there an emphasis on being connected to a tzaddik? So there's many answers to this question, but one answer that the Rebbe gave at this time was, the Rebbe said that we are living in a generation when Jews across the world are under very, very different circumstances. And the Rebbe gave an example of, I'll give you the wording of the Rebbe in a moment, but just the general idea. Jews in Russia struggle because they don't have access to the basic mitzvahs. They don't have access to get a lulav and etrog on Sukkot. They don't have access to matzah. They don't even have access to tefillin. While Jews in America have plenty of opportunities to these mitzvot by simply going to a store and you have the most beautiful pair of tefillin and you can wear it openly. But Jews in America struggle with another area. They struggle with assimilation, with intermarriage, while Russian Jews don't have that struggle. So in the Rebbe's words, what the Rebbe said is, Russian Jews have self-sacrifice in abundance, but no tefillin. American Jews have tefillin in abundance, but no opportunity, or they don't have the self-sacrifice. So the tzaddik, which like chapter 2 of Tanya quotes from the Zohar, the tzaddik is like the brain, like the head of the Jewish people. And all the Jews, all the veins of the body are connected to the head, are connected to the brain. So the tzaddik, which is at the head, is in tune with all the Jews from all over. They're in tune with the Jews in America. They're in tune with the Jews of Russia. And they're able to transfer some of the self-sacrifice of the Russian Jews to be able to go to the American Jews. And they're able to take some of the basic mitzvah opportunities of the American Jews and compensate and transfer it over to the Jews in Russia. Because our generation is all about compensation. And so that's the story. But going back to the question we started with, to make sure we finish the circle over here, that's why the question we started with is, why would a Kohen who had a deformity, who had a mum, why would why couldn't they serve? And the answer we're giving now, based on this idea of Hasidus, that there's two forms or two models, I would say, within Judaism. There's the ideal model, which was temple times, and there's a less than ideal model, which is compensation. And during exile times, temple time was ideal. Everything had an order and balance. And therefore, person with a defect is all about compensation. It's nothing bad, but he has a different role, a different mission. He's compensating for a defect through qualitatively enhancing or excelling in another area. That was a different mission than what the temple was all about. The temple was about balance. And therefore, the Kohen that had had a defect, was living a different mission or a different style, a different model than what the temple era was about. It's not discriminatory at all. It's just a different model. The Kohen at the time with the was really living an exile type of Judaism, which is beautiful. It's about compensation, but it just wasn't the model of that time. And vice versa, our generation is all about compensation. We all lack in one way or another. We don't have that balance during the times of the temple. And therefore, the majority of us are not tzaddikim. It's almost like the tzaddikim, which spiritually are the people without a defect, are the odd ones out. They're the ones looking to mingle in and to be part of the norm, which is compensation in a generation that is all about compensation, and they don't have the need for compensation, and therefore they're not excelling in one thing more than another because they have the perfect balance. Anyway, the point here in chapter 6, let's bring it all together for the chapter on Teshuva. The book 3 of Tanya, which is what we're in the thick of, is all about Teshuva. We've been engaged in a conversation after getting through the basics of Teshuva. We're now in the topic of the mysticism of Teshuva. That Teshuva, as we have explained starting from chapter 4, is not about just fixing a local mess up. That we've sinned and you're trying to avoid punishment, and therefore you do Teshuva, you ask for forgiveness, you let go of the sin, you even fast to go a step beyond it, which is not even Teshuva anymore. In chapter 4, we started saying that there's a macro, a much bigger impact than the sin that you just did here. There's an impact in God's name. There's an impact in the universe. There's an impact in the spiritual world. The godly energy has been impacted, and it's been fragmented through the sin that you committed. So our job through Teshuva is we have to repair not only the relationship with God, but also the spiritual energy that was lost, or the spiritual energy that went into the klipa, or the name of God that was fragmented. So you need to repair your soul, which has been cut off from its consciousness from Hashem. And so through sin, your soul has either a strand of the rope or a bigger part of the rope that's been severed. Teshuva needs to bring it back. You need to repair it. The quote from the Zohar that we said in chapter 4 is Teshuva is Tashuv Hay, to return the hay back into God's name, which means you have to make yourself whole again. You have to make your soul whole again, and you have to make God's name whole again. So chapter 6 says all this talk about Teshuva exists in the ideal model of Judaism. When everything was in balance, when you were connected and you saw blessings, and then you sinned, you were cut off. Your cord was cut off because you let go of the balance that was there during the time. And therefore you would pass away by the age of 50 or by the age of 60. But today, we see people living immoral lives, less than ideal, cheating and everything but good, and yet they don't die by 50. They die peacefully at the ripe old age of 100. How could that be? So the Alter Rebbe in chapter 6 is explaining this idea, because we live in a world of imbalance. We live in a post-temple era, and our exile is defined by chaos, lack of order, But as a result, there's also the concept of compensation. We can get away with more, but we also have much bigger opportunities and compensation in a quality that was not available, or the opportunity wasn't there from before. Which means in temple times, it was much easier to connect with God. The second you walked into the temple, you were on fire. Over here, walk into synagogue, it's not expected that you're going to be inspired. So it's harder to connect. You could keep Shabbat and not see the blessing. You could keep Shabbat, and the 5 minutes before Shabbat, there's chaos in the house, and there's yelling, and there's stress, and there's tension, or it's Erev Pesach, and it should be the celebration of freedom, and there's tension in the home. It's all about chaos. So it's much harder to connect. But when we mess up and we go out of line, in temple times, it was much harder to reconnect. During our generation, we're all about reconnection. So it's harder to connect, but it's easier to reconnect. In temple times, you were connected. But when you were out of line, it was a one strike and you're out model. You gave up on your mission. But during a time of exile, the Shekhinah itself, the divine presence itself, went to exile. So the divine presence is off the center also. While in temple times, the center of it all was the Shekhinah, and that was the truth, and that was the epicenter in the temple. But now, during the time of Galut, exile, even the Shekhinah itself is off center. So we are kind of off center with God. So even when we sin, we could reconnect. Everything is tangled. So Teshuva has a much deeper meaning than during temple times, because now our reconnection that we have with the Shekhinah is so true that the ideal is not there anymore, and therefore the compensation, which is the Teshuva, has a whole new meaning than in more than in previous times. And that's really the heart of the chapter. That we all make mistakes, but then we refocus. And that's because we live in a time that's defined by polarity. And we see that so clearly in our generation. There's such an extreme, such a polarity. And with that polarity comes compensation. And therefore, if we're lacking in one place, we could compensate. Like the Rebbe told the wounded soldiers, you're Mitziyanei Tzahal. You're all about the ability to compensate, the resilience that it comes with. And that's the power of Teshuva that we have now. And that answers the question also that we started, I think, in chapter 4. Why is it that we don't die from a sin by the age of 50 or 60? So we're going to read inside the answer to this question in chapter 6, a little bit of a cliffhanger because we gave the general idea, but in chapter 6, we'll get the answer inside. And I'll just conclude with just one story. There's a shliach, a Chabad rabbi, that I'm friends with the family. I'm like very, very close friends with the family. Their last name is Telvin. And one of them is a Chabad rabbi now in Wilmette, Illinois, that I'm very close with him. We're the same age. We went to yeshiva together. So their father is a senior Chabad rabbi from the 70s. And he did not grow up religious. He grew up very secular. And he started becoming more and more observant. And he went to yeshiva. He got to know Chabad, and he met his wife, and they were ready to get married. And when he was feeling very strong, very on his game now, and he felt it was appropriate, it was the right time to go to the Rebbe, and it was the custom at the time that before the marriage, you would go into the Rebbe to get a blessing. So he was feeling very, as he had his life in order. And he went to the Rebbe for a blessing, not only for his marriage, but also to fix his past. In Hebrew, it's called a tikkun, a way to repair the terrible mistakes that he made in his, in his teenage years when he was not religious, and he did things that he now realizes he definitely shouldn't have done. There were sins. And the Rebbe's answer to him was, he was expecting the Rebbe to advise him, learn this book of the Torah, fast this amount of times. And the Rebbe said, your tikkun, your mode of repair is if you dedicate your life to make sure that others don't fall in the area that you fell in. That's your tikkun, to be there for others. That's how you would bring closure to your own lacking of your neshama. And he dedicated his life to that. He became a Chabad rabbi, and he's in Long Island now, in New York. So the point is that today there's so many opportunities to fix, and that's through compensation, by being there for others, to not fall in the places that we fell, to give in our way, to give it our all. And that's the beauty of our generation, and that's the teshuva of our generation, that we're all about that compensation in a place of imbalance and polarity. That's actually the beauty of the teshuva of our generation. So there's definitely a lot more to go into, but the general theme of the chapter will be understanding the difference between teshuva during temple era and teshuva during exile era, and the difference then between the sins that were committed then and the punishments that it brought immediately, whereas the sins that we commit now, and the difference of the tikkun, the repair, the way we have it. So we're a little over time, but God willing, next week we'll learn the chapter inside, chapter 6 of the book of Teshuva. But we'll just take any questions if there are any.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. It puts more emphasis on the tikkun, because in the temple area, it's like it already reset. I'm just trying to think through this. So there was a reset with truth that was visible, was very clear, where now there's the way to reset is in where things are chaotic or unclear, is to do tikkun, and that kind of brings a light. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Exactly, because that tikkun is the compensation for what we were lacking or what we are lacking. We strengthen in other areas, like the wounded soldier that has, it brings out the other side of them that is stronger than by other people. So we may be lacking in our strength from temple times, but we compensate with it in that time of imbalance in other areas that we could do even stronger than before. And that's
So
going to be the teshuva of our generation.
thank you. And then there's a concept I'm still trying to get my head around, and it's going to be a longer conversation. But you've mentioned it like in the class last night quite a bit, and then today about getting a blessing. Is there a way you can do the 30-second unpack and then maybe unpack that another time? But you talked about going to the tzaddik, but what is the getting the blessing?
Yeah, and you saw a bunch of the videos, right? They were coming for a blessing, whether for a surgery or for anything else. They would come get a blessing. I think we could unpack it more, but in short, when you went to the Rebbe, it was almost like a spiritual realignment session. A blessing means in Hebrew the word baruch or bracha also comes from the word in Hebrew of berach, of brecha, which is the idea of bringing down, like in Hebrew, maybe Aramaic, a creek that goes from a higher place to a lower place is also has that Hebrew word of a brecha, or the idea of mavrich in Hebrew is the idea of grafting, which you take a branch and you lower it into the ground, and it turns into another planting. In Hebrew, it all comes from the word of berach or baruch, which is the idea of a blessing, but it's also the idea of bringing down. When you went to a tzaddik to receive a blessing, you were actually going to get a window into the depths of your soul that you have, and you're just lacking the ability to uncover or to express. When you went to the tzaddik, he was able to almost see within you the source of your soul and bring it down to you. So the blessing that from the tzaddik was really um, allowing yourself to see your true self and receive the blessing from how your soul should be receiving it from on high. Definitely more to talk about on it, but the point is that the tzaddik didn't give you a blessing from his own. He was able to give you a blessing based on the power of your soul. And therefore, many people, before going to the Rebbe, they would prepare themselves. They would commit to what's called a haflata. They would take a resolution on a new area of Torah to be more careful about a certain mitzvah, because they knew that the whole interaction is really within them. It's the window of their soul that they're trying to deepen, and realign with their true entity, with their true identity.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Sava. Thank you, Vivian and Freight. I think we lost them already. Thank you, Shira.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next week.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm going to
May
be gone.
God-
Next week. I won't be here. I'm so sorry, but I'll try to
next
listen.
week.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'll be
listen.
in Santa Barbara, California. So my
Oh,
favorite.
are you having a reunion?
No, I'm going to a leadership conference. I don't even know anyone